Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our 12th Polstock community. We're just going to wait a few more moments until enough people have subscribed so that we can start. Okay, and I just got a message that we're with more than 80 already and more people will join us soon. So let's start. So good afternoon and thank you everybody for attending our Polstock community around change management. Since our keynote speaker, Professor Denise Rousseau, will do her presentation in English, I think it's easier for everybody that we do the entire thing in English, including my introduction. We have more than 270 people who subscribed to today's session. We know from the past also that not everybody who subscribes will attend in person, but we expect quite a lot of people. So we can already say that change management is a very popular and hot topic. I'm not sure, because I see that my introduction slide is in Dutch. I'm not sure if Denise speaks a little bit of Dutch, but I can translate it. So the slide, the title of our community, which you see on the slide, is change, ? And then the subtitle, but we already do that for more than 10 years, ? Exclamation mark. So is that true or not? Is there a lot of innovation in change management? What does the science say? I think that's what we're going to find out today. I will start with a quick introduction, between 5 and 10 minutes, and then we give the floor to Denise, who will have 45 minutes to give her keynote presentation. And then afterwards, Denise and me, we will go into debate discussion mode, although maybe debate and discussion, it's maybe better to use the word dialogue. We will go into a dialogue where we'll also tackle a lot of the questions that you have sent us beforehand. David Bowie already sang in 1971, and I'm not going to sing the quote because it's quite hard to sing. I will just quote it. Changes, turn and face the strange. Change management and organizational development is Polstock's biggest service or product when we look at it from a revenue perspective. So we cannot say that it is strange to us, but still there's a lot to explore. And I think David Bowie is without a doubt the ideal rock and roll legend to embody change. As a true chameleon, he switched from character to character, from style to style. We see Ziggy Stardust, Major Tom, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke, etc. And also in change management, we see also different methods and different tools. But is there also a common base? Maybe we can call that common base evidence-based change management. Is there a framework with guidelines, with approaches, with tools that work better than others? Let's also find that out today. Now, for the first time participants to our community, the different communities we already organized, what exactly is a Polstock community? So we started with these Polstock communities 4 years ago. It's actually a kind of an HR tour of Flanders. So in the past years, you see all the teams. I'm not going to delve into detail into them, But we talked about coaching, we talked about performance management, about well-being, contingent workforce, HR data, learning and development, even about the scientific method. And now for the first time, we have organized a community totally around change management. Who do we invite to our communities? And here we make a reference to our logo, the Polstock logo, which is a giraffe on an iceberg. Polstock communities are we organize them for different types of giraffes. And we always invite, of course, our client, or more than 500 public and governmental clients that we have, but also our communities are also there for our more than 70 private suppliers, HR suppliers. And of course, we also don't forget two other types of partners, our academic partners and other stakeholders. Now, before I introduce Denise to you, some practicalities. The microphone of all participants is automatically muted, and it's impossible to unmute that. I'm very sorry for that, but it's, otherwise it would be total chaos. So all the mics are muted. Questions for the debate or the dialogue afterwards can be asked in the chat. However, we already received tons of questions beforehand, so we will already have a lot to talk about during the dialogue session. But should someone have a very urgent question, he or she can of course pose that, and we will see if we can deal with it. But thanks already for so much interest and inspiration. And I would also love to thank EY for hosting or helping us to host this community on their WaveSpace platform. Now, the Polstock colleagues and myself, we are very, very proud to present Professor Denise Rousseau as our keynote speaker for today. Denise will be joining us from, I might be mistaken, but from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Is that possible? Okay, well, that's great. So she's joining us from the States, from Pittsburgh. Denise is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University with a rich career in academic HR and academic personnel and organization. Actually, I met Denise the first time, but we briefly chatted then 4 years ago, actually almost exactly 4 years ago to this day, because this picture on the slide popped up yesterday in my Facebook memories feed. And I saw, and I even, I posted it on Facebook because I was, it was a very nice and interesting presentation. She gave a presentation at an HR event in Brussels, organized by Balance HR, if I remember correctly. And I was quite impressed with her talk. And I wrote down on Facebook, when two passions collide, evidence-based management and her godmother, Denise Rousseau, in a rock and roll temple. And I think we can still use those that quotation, that Denise is really at the base of evidence-based HR. Together with Erik Barens, she is also the author of the probably evidence-based management book, which holds, of course, a special place in the Polstock library. And Denise also founded in 2007 the Center for Evidence-Based Management, where she currently holds the academic chair. And Polstock is member of SEBMA, and I can imagine many attendees today also are member of SEBMA. Moreover, we used the insights in her article, Successful Organizational Change, that she published and wrote together with Jeroen Stouten and David de Kremer. We used that to structure our latest tender about organizational development. We used that to develop some criteria, quality criteria, which we used to select the suppliers who we then gave a contract for our service organizational development. Apart from change management, Denise also developed the concept of a psychological contract, and she also identified the phenomenon of, and this is a difficult word in English to pronounce, idiosyncratic deals, the so-called ideals. That's the word I know and what we use here in Flanders. So wow, I would say, and she still found some time to speak at our event. So that's great. So Denise will try to answer the question today, if there is such a thing as evidence-based change management. I imagine the answer to this question will be yes, or I hope at least that the answer to that question is already yes. But then what kind of evidence is there and how can we implement this? And then after Denise's talk, which will last for 45 minutes, I will go into dialogue with Denise, as I told you before. So without further ado, I would like to give the digital floor to Denise, and I'll see you back in 45 minutes.
Hello, everybody. Get myself oriented here. It's very nice to have this opportunity to talk with you all today on my favorite topic, the intersection of two passions in my own research and in my career. I have to compliment Vincent and the Pull Stock community for really pushing the edge of the envelope to combine science and practice in a really rich and thoughtful way. Because fundamentally, how we learn is through reflection and conversation with each other and varieties of evidence in that conversation. So I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation with you all today. And I will tell you where we're going. You have a copy of the paper from Vince, and that is the kind of the bedrock of this talk, but it has a backstory in that I've been corresponding for a number of years with Jerome Stoughton from KU Leuven. And he got the idea first. What if we looked and organized the literature, all that research on change management to find what are the practitioners saying is the right thing to do, and what does the research evidence support? And have these two sides talk to each other, and maybe they can join forces in a more effective way. And the product of that joining forces is the paper that was shared with you. And I'm going to hit the highlights of that paper today. So that's my goal here. So the backstory of this paper, which was published a couple of years ago in the Annals of the Academy of Management, is it's very hard, as you might know, as a practitioner, to go out and find evidence in the research databases and then summarize it for yourself to find an answer to a question. And I often say, evidence is not answers, that the answer comes from evidence being rubbed together with the reflective insights of the practitioner and feedback from the stakeholders. Answers are a product of a process that we're going to talk about today. The evidence itself doesn't answer the practical problem, but it does give direction. And there we found, by looking at the literature, that there were 10 key findings that were robust. The literature cumulatively supported them, and they were sensible from the perspective of what we know about behavioral science and cognition and human motivation. And so I'm going to offer you today the 10 key findings. And in that process, I want to also give a little tip of the hat to Stephen Tenhave, whose change management organization did a series of rapid evidence reviews on a variety of change issues. And we were able to draw on that for this paper. So giving credit where credit is due, we all stand on each other's shoulders, so to speak. So one of the reasons why I like the giraffe on the tip of the iceberg. So 10 steps, I'm going to lay them out. in 5 sets of practices, 5 chunks. And I know you guys know this stuff. Whether or not we're always acting on this knowledge is another matter. And that's perhaps one reason why some basic findings in change management, well supported by like 40 years of research, bears saying again, because maybe we can look at them with somewhat fresher eyes in the light of now all that practice experience and training that you have in your work and academic life. We're always learning. And one of the features of people who are on a path to expertise in an area is that the capacity for reflection and absorbing different kinds of information grows. And if this chat today might give you a little energy or food for thought in that process, I would be honored to be a part of it, because it's a process, it's a journey I'm on too. So the first step, begin with the end in mind, get started and start with a diagnosis. So the first 2 steps of the 10 evidence-based practices that Geron and Richard and I found in our deep dive into literature dealt with the issue of diagnosis. Do we really understand what the heck is going on in the organization that we're being brought in or we're a part of and we're trying to help? And that diagnosis has 2 parts. And I'm going to tell you some stories in each of the parts to sort of illustrate the key idea. So first issue we found across the board in the research was that acceptance of change and ultimately successful implementation was predicated on getting valid facts about the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. What's the evidence that this is really the problem? That we're going to now build a change, a solution set to solve that problem. And is that evidence trustworthy? So one of my favorite examples, because I've come back and forth through this particular field site many times now, was it's a local hospital, very big medical center, that in response to the Affordable Care Act in the United States, which is sometimes called Obamacare, which put a premium on patient safety and outcomes and revamped how a good deal of the reimbursements for patient care was done in the United States. The organization, the surgical department of this healthcare system decided, oh, they're changing the rules. Let's change the physicians' contracts. Let's pay them differently so they'll do more like what the rules want them to do. Well, if you know anything about hospitals, touch physician salaries, that's the 3rd rail, and it's electrified and it's very dangerous. But there was also this issue. Why the heck do we think that you have to pay them differently in order to get surgeons to engage in practices that are better for patients? In fact, the surgeons were kind of insulted that the issue was their contract. That brouhaha around contracts was a huge distraction, because a year later, when I encountered this organization again in the context of a implementation of data systems, the diagnosis became, from people who had dealt with the pushback from the docs, real issue was the doctors don't trust the information technology system to report on the practices they are engaging in accurately or to assess the outcomes, because the data are patchwork. The data weren't transparent. But anybody knows anything about data systems, if you build a system with stakeholder input, over time it gets better because they'll tell you. So the issue there was, the problem was probably one more of the way in which the metrics were being captured rather than the incentives. So getting the facts regarding the nature of the problem. If you don't solve the right problem, well and good, the outcomes are not necessarily going to be anything like what we hope for or anticipate. So that's that issue of diagnosis. and spending time at the front end. Consistently in organizations where people spend time trying to figure out what really is the problem, and they use multiple sources of evidence from stakeholders, from the organizational data, the expertise of people inside the organization, they get a better take on what's really going on. And that promotes a whole host of other virtuous things we'll talk about in the next slides, but not the least of which is trust on the part of the change recipient that this change makes sense. So the diagnosis part's huge. It should be visible, it should be talked about, and should have multiple sources of evidence. Second part of the early steps of change management, evidence is very consistent, is that the readiness of the organization for something new is a big bodacious deal. And the recommendation becomes assess and address the organization's readiness to accept and respond to and dedicate resources to a new change. I phrase this as, is there bandwidth for a change? So are they busy doing hundreds of other things? And this is yet another project? Is there a way of rebundling what's already being done so it's less burdensome? Are there some things that can be subtracted from the remit so that if this change is important, resources are freed up? And another aspect of bandwidth, it's not just energy and hours of the day, it's trust. Because one of the things that, as you well know, I know in your own practice areas, that if the relationship between workers and managers is high quality, people are very accepting and responsive to what they will see as legitimate initiatives and directions from senior leaders. But if trust is low, even a small request feels huge because it's a burden in an already troubled relationship. So the second aspect of the diagnostic phase is this idea of attending to issues of bandwidth, and that early phases of the change process might be to ready the organization for something new, either in terms of planning the remit relative to other areas of work that people are responsible for, but also time spent to work on relational repair. So first and foremost, diagnose, get the lay of the land. Second set of evidence-based processes on our way to our 10 have to do with the competency that people in the organization have to engage in the change. You know, so that and so I'm talking about building competence for this change and future changes as they might come, and also a pathway to direct where the attention of these leaders who are now becoming more skilled in implementing change, directing their attention to appropriate intervention. So a competence and a pathway. So talk about each of these. So the third step in an evidence-based process is to develop effective change leadership throughout the organization. Already made the point that trust in leaders is a key issue. It's not rocket science, we know that. But what's often not clear, certainly to senior leaders, is that their competence as perceived by their employees is a big piece of trust. Trust probably has two sides in the labor management relationship. One is, do you have my interests at heart? Will you hurt me? Will you help me? And then the other is, are you able to do what you claim to be doing? Competence. And very often employees are not particularly impressed with the capabilities of their senior leaders. They've seen stumbles before, or maybe poorly implemented change. And the attribution can be they're not trustworthy, or the attribution can be they're not capable. So effective change leadership very often starts with something like this. And so I've seen this repeatedly, which is where the HR folks in the organization, with their own talent or by bringing in someone else, develops kind of a local university in the organization to help first senior leaders develop the chops to engage in effective change, and then cascading that training down. Because part of the issue here is, do they have a kind of a valid understanding of what change processes look like? Do they understand the skill component? Do they understand the role of participation and information sharing? You know, Change Management 101, we drill down into these effective change leadership programs. And one of the big issues here, this takes some time, but it bears fruit because people learn complicated behaviors like change leadership from seeing it done. And we need models at the top who know the moves. And this can be a very important thing. So it takes time to build. This can also be an opportunity for us to address the second point on the last slide, which is the notion of readiness, because one can begin building and rebuilding trust at that point. Okay, so the training part, HR leads this, some other support is brought in, but starting at the top and working all the way down. And I can't tell you the number of times when I've worked in organizations where people have said, it changed how I thought about myself as, in this case, it was a nurse, when I began participating in a shared leadership activity because of how they treated me. So helping people figure out how to better treat their staff, very important for modeling and supporting change. The fourth step that Jerome and Richard and I identified in this broad array of 40 years of literature it is really, I think, quite profound. Some of it I know you already do, but there's another part of it maybe you don't. And so I'm hoping that'll be of value. So step 4 really says, choose interventions and solutions that are known to work. Okay, so duh. If we're making a plan in order to improve the capabilities and problem-solving capacities of a group of people, well, we'll use training activities and training supports and practice opportunities and mentoring, because we know from the research evidence that if you're going to train people in new behaviors, the best way to get that training to transfer is practice on the job and mentoring and coaching on the job following the training. That's like a vitamin pill for implementing effective training. It's the follow-up to the training. So using interventions that are known to work and using them appropriately, that's probably duh, of course. You know, we don't want to use them poorly, but it's bear saying, because it's not uncommon in organizations for people to say, oh yeah, we did Agile. Well, what did they do when they waved their hands and they did Agile? Did they follow the protocol for developing this kind of work process and decision-making support activity? Were the people trained? What routines did they use? How well were these implemented and supported? It's one thing to say we did X. It's another thing to have done X appropriately. So one of the issues is, let's use the solutions that we've identified in an effective manner, not just adopt the label. But that's kind of obvious, and I know it's obvious. So let me give you the bigger idea that came out of our deep dive into the change management literature. And that is to lay out your change in a process, in a logic that basically specifies what your theory of change is. And I'd love a show of hands, but I can't see you to get one, of how many of you use the concept and the modeling of a theory of change in your change practice. So think about what that might mean. Now, a theory of change is, or a logic model, those terms are used interchangeably, is basically a specification, like a framework that explains how something works, that can be tested for sense. You know, should it work that way? Do we really, is that really going to be enough to make this effect happen? It can be tested for sense and logic and evaluated against evidence. So a classic example of a theory of change might be something that says, well, we're going to use a a panel, a balanced scorecard, and we're going to use goal setting. And we're going to use the scorecard to evaluate the progress on the goals. And that's going to give people feedback. And that's kind of the logic. But one of the critical aspects of goal setting is, do people accept the goal that is being assigned or created? Goal acceptance is the keystone, the center part of the effects of goals on outcomes. How do we know the goal was accepted? Do we evaluate? Do we support acceptance? Do we check to see if people understand what and why? Does it make sense to them? Do they see it as legitimate? Because, you know, once the goal is accepted, outcomes follow, because that's a very robust theory of change. Goal setting, goal acceptance, performance. Just a simple pathway. Critical idea for us in the context of change is that we may, as a function of the complexity of the problem, identify a whole host of potential interventions that we might want to bundle together. Goal setting, feedback on the scorecard, training, problem-solving teams that are working on dealing with a particular practice area in the organization that's seen as problematic. All these interventions that are bundled together as part of our change consultation can be formulated into a logic or a theory of change. So we say, if we do this, what should happen next? What's the mechanism that gets us from goals to this outcome? How is training supposed to work? What's the mechanism that leads to next steps? Who does it work for? How do we support it? The theory or the logic of change is basically writing out or picturing a pathway for how the interventions translate into outcomes, and specifying what has to happen in the middle, so we're sure to assess if it has. So the example I like to use, this is just a simple one. It's a logic model for mergers and acquisitions. So logic models usually start with, some inputs or some action, then they specify a bunch of outcomes. So the general theory of mergers and acquisitions goes something like this. If we combine, let's say, an organization that has 200 call centers and we reduce them to 30 call centers throughout the world, that merging of the call centers should create an economy of scale in that mystery questionnaire box. That economy of scale should produce cost savings, should allow us to be more efficient, get higher quality service, and that will have an impact on our business. So that's kind of the general simple logic of a merger process. But the critical idea where that question mark is what did they do in the middle after they went from 220 call centers to 35? And so now we had many more call centers with more than 200 or 300 full-time equivalent employees in these centers. So they're big places of which there are fewer. And how does that translate into better outputs and outcomes? Well, the logic of a merger process to achieve economy scale is you're supposed to be able to reduce redundancies, reduce overhead, identify those processes that have been used in the 200 different call centers, and pick the best ones, and then run your new integrated call centers on the best, most efficient processes. That's a lot of work after combining all of these different call centers. And will you be surprised to know that in many organizations, after they've combined the call centers and they've gone from a lot of little ones to a few big ones, the follow-up work to actually redesign processes to get those so-called economies of scale does not happen. And when it doesn't happen, what you have are costs going up because you need more supervisors, not fewer, when the processes are less reliable. The attempts to get control over processes, if they aren't supporting integration, very often are quite labor intensive. So the outcomes, the logic model of the merger approach is not pursued. That that arrow, that question mark becomes, and the miracle happens here rather than a logical pathway. I will make the comment to you also that in the United States, a lot of nonprofits use a logic model or theory of change because they don't have resources to waste and have to persuade multiple stakeholders that their programs are well thought out of. If you're trying to explain to stakeholders the nature of the change process, laying out a logic model that specifies the activities, the outcomes, and the assumptions of what has to happen in the middle, so you can pay attention to those assumptions, becomes very useful in helping people understand the change. So now we've done the diagnosis, we've kind of figured out what's what, and we've worked on our readiness, and change competence is being developed. Fresh looks are being taken at what the capabilities are needed in the organization to build skills. And we started fleshing out what the theory of change or the logic of the change will be. That can be done by a dominant coalition, that those senior leaders, a variety of different collaborative arrangements. Now we get to the part about getting the message out. Okay, and so we're really in the middle of the change now. And the basic thing that Geron and Richard and I came up with over and over again was, hey, communicate, and then make a plan to communicate. That it's very clear redundancy is good, essential, and an inherent part of effective change. One key aspect, no surprise to anybody here, is the role of developing and communicating a compelling vision. And so I know you guys know a lot about vision, far be it for me to tell you anymore, but I tease my students and sometimes the organizations in which I work to say, well, do you know the difference between a hallucination and a vision? Because there's a big bodacious difference. Hallucination is what we get when senior leaders say, oh, let's just go and improve shareholder value. That'll rally the troops. And then they lay off 10% of the workforce who really wonders what those guys are smoking at the top. Hallucination is a private pleasure. It is, or a private fantasy. It's not shareable in a way that creates excitement and value to others. A vision, the compelling vision, critical idea, is that it must be shared and heartfelt, not the interests of one side imposed on another, but something that reduces fault lines and frees up energy for something more holistic. That's what a vision is. And to be compelling, it needs to reflect heartfelt, pre-existing values people have, if not necessarily pre-existing ideas. So compelling vision is important, and that's echoed over and over and over and over and over and over in all the literature. Relatedly, we're now into the mechanics of the change process. Having a vision is important for meaning and the redundancy of being able to talk about this, the idea that this change is about creating maybe a shared community of care for our patients or our clients, regardless of their role or their standing or the kind of job they have, or if they're the day shift or the night shift, that sense of we. The enabling practices create sort of the mechanics of moving people in their actions and energy and attitude in a constructive fashion. And we found repeatedly that enabling practices appear throughout the literature to support implementation. And I'm going to do a slide next that explains the enabling practices, but I want to stress one thing here, and that is you need a plan how to use the enabling practices. And that plan, I'm suggesting, is your theory of change, that you map those out in advance. So this comes from a paper that Stephen Tenhove and I are working on right now, and it's been a joy to work with him. And you'll notice that the enabling practices that we are talking about here cut across stages of the change. So from getting started when we were doing that diagnosis at first, right, and the initiation when We're starting to perhaps support managers to do new things and to begin developing our theory of change. So in that early middle phase, to the transition when initiation is up and running, to the sustaining phase. Across all these phases of the change process, we find basically that 5 enabling practices appear and reappear in effective and successful organizational changes. Goal setting, goal setting, it's management 101, it's group life 101. Goal setting works, so the idea of creating goals that direct attention, supporting progress on goals, developing task strategies around goals. Goals are very important for the motivation and skills they build. Make sense across all phases. Okay. Vision communication. We develop and articulate the vision early, but its communication goes across all phases. One of the things we do see, which is really interesting, I've enjoyed some of the ethnography on change management, is to see how visions they get fleshed out in the communication. That same vision is at the core, but people come to see it in more personalized terms. And so it develops over time through this communication process. Fairness and justice, attention to the fact that in change, very often losses are more painful than the gains are good, because the losses come first and people are more aware of what they're losing and what they might be getting down the road. So the issue of fairness and justice, support for people who are on the short end or stressed by the change, so that in effect they can be restored to some level of what seems to them to be equity, and also at the same time to have a process where the procedures in the change can be vetted and people discuss them, so that they appear to be fair and they're understood by people who will be exposed to the processes. So fairness and justice across the board is a theme you'll see in many, many studies. Transition structures is an interesting one, cross-cutting practices. So I mean all those things that you folks do every day when you're creating a task force to work on a particular aspect of the problem, where there's a coalition that comes together at the outset to plan the initial strategy for the change, or the group that develops, perhaps with the consultant support, the theory of change. All of those are temporary groups. Movement comes and goes. That are important across the board in the change process. And how to manage transition structures, that's a little more fuzzy. I'll be quite honest. I didn't think the research was very clear on what are the procedures that work best. They reinforced the value of having transitional arrangements. One of my favorite transitional arrangements is actually the using of idiosyncratic deals to motivate people to try new things, but personal interest in that. And the last is the issue of feedback and redesign, gathering data on what's working and what's not, and going forward. As we've created this web of practices that are targeting a set of changes, working out our theory of change, and using the enabling practices to focus attention, build skill, get feedback, learn by doing, we're now in a position where the literature is actually quite exciting, I think, on this. So it's a finding that I wasn't looking for, but it was very clear. The role of tapping networks and bottom-up innovation in an organizational change. So one of the things we saw repeatedly, and it was not just in healthcare, though in healthcare it makes real sense why it would be the case, the role of social networks and intact groups as the focus of the change process. I don't know about you, but a long time ago, before cars, when I was trained as an industrial psychologist, we often talked about change in terms of targeting individuals, to improve their ability, their motivation, their opportunity to practice. And the role of the social group got less attention. That's not accurate. So the research literature really is very clear that it's important to engage people in their intact groups and to help them create networks of other actors interested in the change across the organization, because Change is a socializing process that people are co-creating new ways of doing things. And it's a lot easier to come up with an idea, implement it, and try it again when someone else is there to help you do it, validate it, support you. Good example of why social networks and intact groups are important is in healthcare, where, at least in the United States, doctors talk to doctors and not to too many other people. Nurses have to talk to everybody. But the idea that if you're trying to influence a physician group, you got to get to them through other physicians. And through the social network of doctors is how you influence their uptake of a new practice. So thinking about who do your people typically talk to is very, very important. Some of the recent research on a change in healthcare underscores the role of social networks and intact groups as the vehicle for working through change processes and sharing ideas and validating them. So an interesting idea is the notion of creating relational spaces. That's the idea of, can people who are maybe trying to reform the processes in surgery or the processes on the floor of the nursing unit, do they have a place, a gathering place where they can meet and talk about what they're doing and how well it works and give each other ideas? So the relational spaces for the diverse actors who are interested in the change, for the reformers, so they get support from other reformers, is very valuable. Because again, it's really hard to be an N of one. There's a lot of inertia in all of us, especially if we expect to have a hard slog in getting our ideas out. Being exposed to other people who support or who would be interested in supporting our ideas is very energizing. So that's a big deal. Second aspect of the network process, this really has to do, both of these have to do with what I think we call emergence, how new things come from the interactions of people, not necessarily top down, but bottom up. That's the social network effect. One of the repeated findings in the research literature is the role of experimentation in microprocesses. The idea of people in the organization, regardless of their rank or level, getting to try out aspects of the change for themselves, pilot test it, see how it works, play with it, and come up with ideas for how it could be used. That very seldom can you plan from the top down a script of what people should be doing. We need people close to the work to flesh out the how and the what. And how that gets supported and communicated and rewarded is hugely important. Some of the research since the 1990s shifts away from the top-down nature of change and more to the once initiated, perhaps at the top, the microprocesses that enable it. This is very valuable, and it relates again to those relational spaces. The people get to share their ideas with others, and also how much latitude people have locally to try new things. And we find that managers who use idiosyncratic deals, bargaining with folks to try new things or to keep doing what they're doing and share it, actually create some energy within their local group to support the change. Last but not least, we're on the last part of the 10 steps. And this has to do with, we've made some progress. What did we learn? And how do we help make the change stick that we've spent all this work and time trying to make happen? So critical issue, no surprise to you all, is the idea that for learning, you have to assess the change and its progress over time and reflect on what we've learned early, middle, and late. But the idea that any change process, for all the heavy lifting we engaged in, let's get some benefit that's got legs for the future. So maybe the next change is easier, the relationships that have been built might be sustainable. So the idea of assessing over time, learning from feedback, creating reflections, telling stories. And last but not least, my favorite phase, the overlooked phase of institutionalizing the change. Once we've done all this heavy lifting, how do we make sure we can bond it to the rest of the organization so its benefit can be supported where we put it in place, and also so it can be scaled up if its full reach has not gone to all the venues in the organization that it has value for. So one of the real issues here is alignment. And it's a lot of the work in institutionalization has to do with what's done to help the HR system better support the change that's been put in place, change maybe the career criteria, if these are new job demands that people need to be supported in doing to keep the change going. not forgetting to socialize the new hires to this new way of doing things, especially if you've really been innovative in your process and it takes special skills. Do we train the new people, not just the folks who went through the change initially, but the attention to institutionalization, capturing the learning, helping the organization better align around the change, capturing the good things. Now, in a conclusion, we did a fast trip through the 10, which I tried to make into 5 because 7 plus or minus 2, 5 things are easier to remember than 10. Critical idea though, when you do one of these reviews and you try to figure out what's known and what's not known about change management from the practitioner side and the research side, one of the things we found, so we did a review of 7 very prominent practitioner approaches. Certainly John Cotter's work would be very key, and Eckhart and some other systems that you folks are familiar with. And we reviewed them, then we reviewed the research literature, and then we looked to see how consistent or inconsistent they were. And they were more consistent than not. So, we're not talking out of 2 sides of our mouth. We're singing from the same book mostly. But there are a couple of concepts that appear in the practice literature that are not supported in the science. And I'd have you reflect on them because I think it's important, because both of these concepts, they have some unfortunate consequences for both the humans in the organization and the success of the change. So the first common concept in the practice literature, and I think it was Cotter who popularized it, is the role of urgency. Cotter says nothing about trying to solve the right problem. He just assumes top management knows. And I think that's questionable. But the other thing that he says is that urgency is essential. You've got to create a burning platform, get people motivated. But all the research literature says is that when people feel a sense of urgency, they are stressed. Stress leads to bandwidth being tighter, people's capabilities being more rigid and less flexible. Change requires flexibility, experimenting and trying new things, and urgency, a gun to your head, puts you on a much narrower path. It's not even logical. So lose that idea, please. And it's not nice to people. Urgency makes us rigid, whereas well-motivated change opens people to possibilities. Second idea to lose, says the research literature, is that resistance is not a common phenomenon. By the way, the research literature defines resistance. We would define resistance as being people who refuse to support the change. Refuse. That's different than saying, I don't like it. I really don't want to do this. That's not resistance. That's human beings defending the status quo. Let's get over that. That's not resistance. That's you and me. Resistance is active sabotage and rejection of the change. It is not common when trust in leadership is high and a change is well managed, because there's reasons why people who trust the organization and who are supported in the change process will take up new behaviors and try new things because the communication supports it. The skills are there. You don't get resistance under those conditions. So let's be careful about what we claim as resistance. My hunch is that it's a way that senior leaders can blame people for management's problems and failing to manage the change well. It's one of those concepts that's not helpful. After you've gone through this process and somebody is still really refusing to do it, you got resistance, baby, and that probably does need to be removed. But until we've built a trustworthy process and given people an opportunity to practice, I am hesitant to use the word. Okay, on that note, I'm done. And I look forward to chatting with you.
Okay. Thank you, Denise. Yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Now for the second phase of the community, during your presentation, you already gave quite some concrete examples out of the practice, but I think when I look at the questions we received, there's a lot of questions that delve deep down into the practice, like help us with your advice, and can you help us with this or that problem. So we have some interesting questions for you, but I also prepared the dialogue session with Denise beforehand, and we think that it might be interesting to make it a little more interactive. And then within this context, it's not that easy, but we would like to ask the audience 3 questions through Mentimeter. So I will share my screen, and the participants, especially people who work daily with change projects or are subject to change, but especially people who do it, it would be interesting to know their honest answers to the 3 questions we're going to pose. And they're related, of course, to the principles that Denise just sketched. So I'm going to share my screen. Yes. Okay. So the first question, and my Menti should be on. If you go to menti.com on your computer or via your smartphone, you can use the code 86714590. And then we would like you to answer this question. Do you perform a diagnosis of the problem before the change is planned? And yes, answer in an honest way.
Oh, this is fun. I like this.
Okay, so we see, most people answer always or most of the times, but then we still have, almost half of the votes, 1/3 of the votes go for sometimes or rarely. If you go to the next question. Do you encourage your social network? And Denise explained what she meant with that social network, that concept, to test drive and experiment with the change. I quite like the word test drive.
Yeah.
It's cooler than experimentation. Yeah.
And it's fascinating when you read the literature to see the description of the experiments and pilot tests and kind of local initiatives people tried, and you say, wow, this is so rich. So
yeah, absolutely. Here we see, and we have lots of people now responding. Also from rarely to most of the time to sometimes. So yeah, it's definitely not a classical procedure that we see in every change project.
Yeah, it is important, because I do think it's also a way that local supervisors and leaders can invite their people in. It gives them, a special relationship to new ideas and innovation. So a way to catch local folks doing something right.
Yeah. And then we have the third question. And that's also an advice we give also a lot from Polstock in the publications we make, is indeed the end, and do you assess the progress by asking the stakeholders about the effects and about the implemented change.
Right.
I think it was in an article by Pfeffer and Sutton I once read that when in companies, when somebody at the end of the trajectory ask themselves, now, was there really a change or not? And they come to the conclusion that there's not a change. They just go for the same consultants to try to get the change done even afterwards. So that's not a good example of how to assess your progress. So yeah, what do we see here?
Yes,
Yeah.
this is a very interesting issue, because the idea of the stakeholders can tell you, did the change reach them? And can tell you what effect, at this point, it's having for them or on them or with them. Because one of the big issues in institutionalizing a change is getting it to scale up and how far reach in the organization. But if we don't assess it, we won't know.
Yeah. What we see here by the answers of the participants, that this is a practice that's more implemented than the previous one. So here we see more people scoring sometimes, and definitely more people scoring most of the times and always. So that's already a very positive to see. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh, and then and there is another question. We don't have to have it up here, but I would be interested if participants can raise their hands. How many of them have used a logic model or mapped out a theory of change in their consulting practice?
I'm not sure if participants can raise their hands in this form.
Only us. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not
you
sure.
You guys raise your hands on your own and give yourselves reinforced if you're doing it, because if you map, they can raise hands. Oh, yay. Okay. Dries, the shooter says.
They can.
Yeah,
Okay.
do it, of course. Because this is important. You find you'll have different conversations with people if you map it out. It's one of those pictures worth 1,000 words.
Yeah. We have 6 attendees who have raised their hands. So it's, yeah, not a lot, actually.
I think it's one of those hidden practices that, like, nonprofits with no money have to do, and bigger organizations more flush with resources don't need to do. But if you do it, you learn about your assumptions, and you have a product you can take to people and say, this is how it should work. Is this how it's working for you? What else is going on? The conversations you will have with people over the model of what the theory of change is, what the logic is very rich. And you can see where assumptions have gone untested and maybe where gaps have not been closed.
Okay. If it's okay for you, Denise, I would like to pose you some questions that we received from the audience. My colleagues from the quality team, because we got a lot of questions, have bundled them in different teams. So we have a theme, 5 questions about conditions for change. We have some questions more based on the theoretical level about the evidence-based management as a concept, the role of the consultant, the role of data, and then also the change fatigue and the resistance to change. That's also quite interesting.
Yep.
There are quite some questions who resemble each other. First one, quite concrete. How do you deal with changes in organization when there is a high turnover among managers and employees, so that sponsorship and support for the change are not embedded, but you have a lot of knowledge that leaves the organization at the same time? So do you have any advice how to tackle that kind of problem?
Well, that's a very interesting issue, I think, guys. And I read that one in advance too. I thought it was a very thoughtful question. I think one of the issues is when you don't have, let's call it the social capital or the organizational capital in place to support the change, like senior leaders are a revolving door. First, there's a tremendous impact on employees as recipients of change when the bosses are unstable or not, or come and go. Trust will be lower, perceptions of competence lower. That's kind of a given. And if it's lower, then what kind of change is implementable? And I think about this circumstance when you have a lot of attrition, is that I think the changes that I would make would be simpler. They would be more operational, structuring, because if you're not keeping your human capital it's hard to build more complex comparative advantage, that you're more likely to be able to build operational routines that are reliable, that deal with a more predictable set of problems. And I would want to structure routines. And I'm actually pulling a page out of what an organization like McDonald's does. You know, so in McDonald's, you have people working in restaurants reliably producing food, and they're doing it with color-coded instructions and very codified processes, which allows a 16-year-old or a 72-year-old serving you to give you a hamburger that tastes just the same. So the role of operational changes rather that are well structured and routinized, where it depends more on workers having an understanding of what they need to do, because you can't go for more complex change, in my opinion, without without social capital in the organization.
Mm-hmm. It's also yeah, you already gave part of the answer of two other questions that were asked. Is like change management in very big organizations. So you mentioned McDonald's. That's of course a gigantic organization. But then more specifically, somebody asks, you cannot involve everyone. That's also impossible. So, but only working with some kind of steering group, like real group of change agents, is also too small. So how do you find that balance? I think it has to do with the compelling vision you also talked about, but still, yeah, how to find that balance and how to get everyone on board.
Okay, so this is a very good question. And I've thought about this too, because we wind up trying to take that social network concept and morph it in different contexts. So the key idea would be, how do we build a change process that ultimately touches everybody? Their involvement doesn't need to be the same, cannot be, but people are embedded in networks. So my idea of a successful way a change could be implemented has features like this. So there is some coordinating team. You know, it's an individual with some supportive persons working with them if it's a surgeon, or it's a team of people if it's an organizational change that's broader. They work with task forces or committees of stakeholders that cut across parts of the organization. So the idea that you have a representation of all the areas in, I don't know if I want to call it a steering committee, that's more like the folks that structured this in the first place, but the steering, the task force is, now we're going to work on, we need a set of processes for figuring out how to reduce the use of transfusions, blood transfusions in our hospital. And that involves pharmacy and nursing and ICU and the step down units and blah, 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 blah. And the perfusionists, how do we get all these people together? And what we do is we get a representative of all those people together in this committee. And so you could have a committee of 20 people as long as it reflects the whole house of the hospital, let's say, that where this issue of blood transfusions is salient. And you work with them, and they have part of their charge is report back to their people. That needs to be scripted, so they get the message out to the folks they're talking to and bring information back repeatedly. But the representation model is important, but you need relational spaces where you're mixing and matching different communities so that you cross networks in these spaces. That's what I would think. And that it's not a one and done, that it probably is this, let's say this committee that I just described to you might work for 9 months on the blood transfusion issue and do the report in and the report out and solve problems and maybe come up with some incentives for people to, you know, get prizes for doing certain things with, you know, coming up with new ideas that we propagate. You know, they have a series of activities that engage their members, but they're sharing their information and their support for the change with each other. That socializing of the change process across networks is really valuable, but I would help to script the role of the actors in the committees so they touched back with their people and brought information in a reliable way.
And do those people you select from those groups, those people who then represent their team or their department, would you advise to also train them in change management, or in setting goals, or communicating, or
Good question, good issue. So I think part of the remit of having, let's say, this cross network committee is that there's some training, there's some updating and information, there's requests for information sharing to help the other groups that are working in the process. That it's like a good board. In a good board, everybody's got as part of a task, and board should be trained and get skills for how to participate and how to report. And they should, in my world, they would be working the theory of change model that we're operationalizing and helping us bullshit test it to see if we're making some assumptions that aren't valid, or, we're overlooking something. It says here A should lead to Z, but, none of the middle is really specified. That they should be working over time to help us better articulate the plan. I always loved what, I know General Eisenhower from World War II, he said, plans fall apart in the first hour of battle, but planning is very important. In the context of change, usually the plans don't fall apart in the first hour, maybe a couple months, but the critical idea is the planning process using the theory of change. You can absorb a lot more information and insight by repeating it over time. And I think that's one of the tasks of the committee.
Yeah, thank you. You also mentioned in your presentation the change models. So you referenced Kotter, Atkar, etc.
Yep.
Did I understand you correctly that you said that when you analyze those older models, that like some of the methods being used in those models, they still work, but there are some parts of it that, yeah, we best throw away in the dustbin? Or would you advise like not use those models, or they can be used as a framework, but be attentive to some specific concepts? Or
Sure. So with the exception of Kotter, because he's got some problems, I would say the other change models that we reviewed, they've stood the test of time. They've stood to science. Their problems are more, they omit things rather than they say things that are misleading. Kotter is a little misleading because of the urgency idea and because of his focus on top-down leadership, totally ignores the bottom-up part. Perhaps the person who's the most savvy, in my opinion, who's a practitioner, but he's also a PhD in organizational psychology. His PhD is probably older than mine, is Michael Beer. And he is a very savvy practitioner, consultant, and has a full scale model that I find very, very thoughtful. It kind of keeps reminding you of all the moving parts to work with one of his frameworks. So I think they're actually quite good because they do get, they capture the bigger picture issues that ought to be modeled in your theory of change. And they're good at reminding us what those should be.
Another question from the same person or same organization. Yeah, we talked in your presentation, yeah, it was based on successful change projects, what we have to do in order to be that change is successful. But if we look at it from the other side, we also, everyone encountered, I worked for a long time in the government. I saw lots of change projects that failed, and some succeeded, but there were a lot that failed. Why do so many change projects fail? Is it the inverse of what you were saying, or are there specific other reasons that make?
Well, to begin with the end in mind, did they do any diagnosis? And were people ready? So odds are pretty good. Steps 1 and 2 explain a lot of the failure. You can have a well-diagnosed, well-supported change on which the wheels still fall off. It's more rare, but it is possible. I mean, I think, in addition to not solving the right problem and not helping people be ready, I think probably the biggest issue for change failure is a failure to deal with the social networks, the social institutional structure. And I'm thinking healthcare organizations, but so if we were in a commercial organization, some of the dynamics may be different. I think anytime you have professions, change is harder because you have people whose socialization pre-exists the organization and have strong categories. It's like it's like adopting adult children all from different religions and expecting them to get along at the dinner table type of thing. But the first two steps probably account for a lot of the failure. Also the fact that there are not that many studies, Vincent, on institutionalization. A successful change that you want to make last. That's a thin literature. There are some. They're often in books as opposed to in articles, but because most organizations don't get to that point. Just like the merger example I used, once they've got the change started, they don't spend a lot of time supporting the later steps that get to the gains, because organizations get distracted. Leaders go off on new shiny objects and forget to continue to take the change to realize its goals. So that's probably another reason, especially in government. New players come in, they don't see the old initiative through because people don't get credit for finishing off somebody else's initiative, which is unfortunate because it could well be a successful intervention for an organization.
Okay. We have another question. It's a very long question, but I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but it's about the concept of trust, which is very important for you, also in your work and your other work. And the person in question, he even used some of your insights for his own, I think it's his own PhD that he made. And he said, I often encounter clients that underestimate the importance of building these bases of inter-organizational trust in transformation projects, such as mergers between government departments. And mergers between government departments, a lot of the bigger change projects we do under the Polstock umbrella are these kind of mergers. So the lack of trust can be a serious risk to the success of the change trajectory. How would you, Professor Rousseau, approach the CEO who is reluctant to spend significant attention on trust building? How would you convince?
It is a very important issue, right? Because I think the evidence would suggest that when trust is high, a big change can feel easy to people. And when trust is low, a small change is a humongous burden. So, trust is the lens through which people view the actions of others. So there's no way we can say that it doesn't matter. It matters a lot. So you want to do it the easy way, you want to do it the hard way, or do you not want to do it at all? I think that would be my first comment to the leader. To create trust in a governmental context, one of the most important issues I think that you can do is to go back to this concept of relational spaces. Because one of the characteristics of people who are in different organizational units and who have in-group, out-group models, I mean, even chimpanzees have mental models of who's us and who's not us. So that in-group, out-group way of thinking is wired in us. How do you reverse that? Exposure and the building of communication and cooperation. So how do you create relationships between people from different ministries or areas, whatever the unit is, where they can actually get to know each other? Because familiarity is a critical aspect to being able to communicate, to know, who should I call? Vincent? Should I call Johnny? Who should I call? If I know you, I can reach out my hand, or I can put a call in or an email, and makes it easier for a relationship to form. So be exposure to people from different backgrounds or areas. Then after some familiarity, so maybe they get trained together, so they got to learn about each other in an informal context. I would look to give them some task, build relationships around tasks, something they care about that they could do together that would give them more reason to trust. And the nice thing about working together on something, you learn who knows what. Brainstorming is a very popular concept in organizations and in schools and whatnot, but all the research literature on brainstorming pretty much supports the idea that it's not really good for innovation. There's other techniques that will get you to better quality ideas faster, but brainstorming is really good to help people learn, well, what does Vincent know? And what does Anil Kumar know that Denise doesn't know? And how do I get that information? So it discloses sort of the resources a person brings to a problem. I think that is creating those relational spaces, first exposure, maybe some training, then a task that they could build ties on, is very valuable. And if we go back to those committees that I was describing for you earlier as a way of touching many parts of the organization, part of the issue there is that it's a shared space. It connects people to other people. It helps them, they can go through each other to figure out, well, who in your area knows something about this? They have a key, they have a broker who can point them to where the information is. You start making an organization more accessible across old fault lines when you build those kinds of spaces. And I think we underutilize that approach, but you need to also give it some time. It needs some months. It needs a couple of tasks, some support, some training, but it bears real fruit. And I can see as somebody who's been in a university a long time, and universities have a lot of silos, the legacy effects of having worked on a common project across schools and colleges can spill over for years. And I see it every day. It's very valuable to keep that up.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very valuable advice and not that difficult to implement, I think. So, yeah. Another interesting question. So we know the 4 sources, of course, but I think most of our public also knows in evidence-based management, to come to better quality decisions, you need different sources of evidence, data, scientific literature, but also stakeholders. And then should we, in a governmental context, also include politicians as stakeholders in a change trajectory?
Do you dare not include them?
Or what kind of power, or how do we have to see that, somewhat specific role in a change trajectory? That, especially, I think, when, like in Belgium and in Flanders, where you have the political level and then the civil servant level. And I don't think it's the same as in the States, where there's more continuity, so it can change here faster. So maybe some thoughts about that.
Well, to me as an American, what goes on in Belgium and all the different governmental systems is a source of infinite fascination. It really. So my hat is off to you. You guys are good at complexity and being adaptive. I do think you can't bypass anybody. Bypassing is disrespectful. It's flying blind to some extent. I think the issue is not to be put off by initial responses, especially politicians, because of all the interests that they manage and the difficulty of maybe getting a public position that aligns with private information. Not necessarily going to be disclosing that. I think the idea of continuing to loop them in and ask for input, getting their frames of reference is really important. These are also people who know the network and can tell us who we should be paying attention to, who they listen to, who they don't. If you ignore somebody in one of the stakeholders, a price will be paid later. And if, at the very least, I think one of the principles in change processes, trust is really important. Obviously, it's really a necessary condition. But it's sort of related to another, kind of social studies kind of concept. It's respect. Respect to me means worthiness of attention, that somebody's interests bear being paid attention to, acknowledged at minimum, and perhaps acted on or followed through on its own ways, but at minimum, showing respect. Because without that, how can there be trust? So I think it's a precursor to it. And I do think that being more familiar with how corporate environments work there, or healthcare, where there's a lot of status issues. There are many communities that feel very disrespected. It's not just in civil society, it's in organizations as well. And a change process that signals the worthiness of attention to a variety of networks in the organizations is really, to me, really authentic and important. It also frees up access to a lot of information you might not have had otherwise about the change. Go back to my initial example of the hospital where they were trying to negotiate the doctor's contracts as a way of solving a problem. Nobody asked the IT people about the quality issues because they were so low on the totem pole. They weren't the doctors, and doctors didn't think to even ask them, even while they were complaining about everything else. So who's not in the room is often very interesting from a change perspective, and we could expand our attention because we can learn things that are maybe the underbelly, it's the iceberg, the underneath part of the iceberg.
Okay. I just got a message that we still have 5 minutes to go. So there's still 2 questions I would like to pose to you. The first one, and it's a kind of related question that we also saw in the community we organized about coaching, and it's about the external agent or the external consultant versus the person who's inside the organization. Now, in coaching, the literature says that, an internal coach can be as good as an external coach, and each role has its advantages and disadvantages. But in a change project, who is best placed to be the true driver for change? Is it the manager? Is it a group, an internal group, or are there advantages of using external consultants who drive the change, or is it a combination? Or
I'm not sure about an external consultant driving the change. I am reasonably confident about the expertise of an external consultant informing a change. And one of the things I worry about, it's a competency trap for external consultants. We tend to do what we're good at. And what we've done before. But I think one of the issues that we're talking about in evidence-based change processes, but are we as good at identifying what the client or the customer or the organization really needs? And so how do we do that diagnosis? That to me is very important. With an appropriate diagnosis, external consultants are huge for the knowledge transfer they bring and the effort to help customize change features, talking with people about, well, how would you implement a new goal program? How would you implement new training, given your organizational features? They need goals, they need incentives, they need a training program, but how it's the flesh on the bones. You can't know as the outsider. We need insiders to help us do that. And I think it's that co-design part that really is valuable. In some of the research I've done with my friends in Ireland, where we've been studying consulting teams, one of the things we found was that the quality of relationships in the consulting team itself were hugely important for their ability to work with clients. And by that, basically mean kind of like their reflective capacity to sit down and problem solve as a consulting team about what we need, having enough time to think about What's our opportunity window here? How well developed is our theory of change? Are we sharing this with the right people and getting it updated? That having that reflective capacity in your consulting team is a big deal, because it differentiated those that could actually benefit from participating with the client in co-design from those consulting firms who couldn't actually create good co-design. They were more likely to try to drop the system that they were designing and leave, as opposed to make a product that was truly solve the local problem. So I think consulting team management is itself something very interesting, because the absorptive capacity and ability to use evidence from different sources, that's really kind of like, that's a superpower for a consulting firm.
Yeah, very interesting. And we can use that maybe in our next tender of organizational development to screen the organizations. But okay, last question. And yeah, there were also 5 questions about change fatigue, resistance to change. And a lot of the commentaries are like, we are fed up with change. There's too much change. The bandwidth that you spoke of is like, no change anymore. Just let us, no transformation, please. So how can an organization deal with that when another change is absolutely necessary, but there's such a history of good change trajectories and probably not so successful change trajectories? How can we deal with that?
Okay, so I've got 2 ideas on that one to share. I don't know if you are aware of, community is aware of this, but an old concept has come back again in research, and it's called subtractive change. Most change in organizations is additive. Let's add another incentive. Let's introduce another training program. Let's add another layer of this, that, or the other function. Subtractive change takes something away. And there is some good research evidence that unmitigated additive change wears people out and is dangerous. And we have it in society, which of course led to, pollution and too many cars on the road and by continuing to have more and different and keeping growing. We just lived through a 1.5 years of subtractive change. That's what COVID was, right? And all of a sudden, people were skateboarding down my street, which is normally full of cars. And the air in Pittsburgh was clear, it was clean. It had not been this clean since, probably 1910. Actually, I knew we're a factory town, maybe 1810. But in any case, the critical idea is subtraction. For all the costs, it gave us something. So the idea here is, can you as a consultant help the organization think about how it might rebundle what it is doing to free up capacity? How might some initiatives that served purpose, but they're legacies and no longer are adaptive, how might they be transitioned out? Because freeing up capacity is what subtractive change is about. So you can do something new. And there's a lot of really good research in this now that I think is exciting and promising. But one of the findings is this: we are blind to the potential of subtraction because we're so used to adding. And also, if you keep adding, you don't tick off somebody who really loves, maybe the one person who really loves a particular practice, they won't be upset. But if you subtract it, you free up resources, but they're going to be upset for a while. This is, I think, something I'd have you think about as in the industry of consultancy, a potential for virtuous subtraction as a way of more efficiently and respectful of human bandwidth, bundling the mix of activities that comprise an organization. Your question had a second part. Oh, and this had to do with, I think I lost it, sorry.
No, you said you had 2 ideas you would love to share, but
in the 10 Commandments,
I cannot read your mind, so no.
Subtractive change. Let's make it that.
Let's keep that as the yeah. It's a very interesting idea, and also because it dates from a while back and it comes back, and there's research now and evidence for that. So yeah, it's quite a yeah. It's an interesting thought to conclude our session. I want to thank you again, Denise. It was yeah, very interesting. We learned a lot, and I have the feeling there's still a lot to say, and I'm pretty sure if we're like next year or in 2 years when we organize a new community, we can absolutely invite you again, and we will have the research will be even further evolved, and let's make it a continuation somewhere along the road. So thank you again for today. I'm gonna now share my screen again for the final slides I have prepared. One moment, please. So yeah, we arrived at the end of our 12th Polestar community. I already thanked Denise, but I also want to thank all the colleagues of Polestar who are involved behind the scenes to make this event possible. And of course, a big thank you to all the participants who made this, because I just got the numbers in. We were with 150 people who were present. So that's a record-breaking session for us. So thank you very much. We would also like to ask you to already mark your calendars for the 23rd of November, and when we will organize our 13th community, and it will be again in a digital format. And you will see it's at 9 a.m., 9 in the morning. So why so early? That's because we will be then joined by Professor Frederik Anseel, also from the other side of the world, and now truly from the other side of the world, because he will be speaking from Sydney, Australia. And he will be talking with us about flexible work and more broadly the future of work. So bookmark the agendas at the 23rd of November at 9 a.m. And before I let you go, the reason we also organize this Polestar community is to celebrate the new contracts we have in our product organizational development. So we work now together with 10 private suppliers. You see them here on the slide. We have Arch, BDO, CC Consult, Deloitte, EY, Ginkgo Consulting, HICT, KPMG, Möbius, and Mondea IDEA Consult. So, and we asked them to present their company to you and their USPs, their specific services. And so, because it's not possible to present 10 organizations and their specific products in one session like this, so we asked them to make a movie, and they all did that. And I already saw a couple of them, and yeah, they're quite amazing. So we will start communicating those movies of our suppliers the next days and week. So please keep an eye on your mailbox and on our social media. So yeah, I think we can conclude this interesting afternoon. So thank you again, and have a nice late afternoon, have a nice evening, and we'll see each other again at our next community. Thank you.
That was fun. Thank you.